It was a quiet evening on Maple Street. The air was crisp and the sky painted with the soft hues of dusk. Harold Johnson, an elderly black man in his late 60s, walked slowly down the sidewalk, his tan suit neat and pressed. He had just finished attending a charity dinner, an event he personally helped organize to raise funds for underprivileged youth. In one hand, he carried a leather briefcase, and in the other, he held a folded umbrella. His steps were steady, and his expression was peaceful. As Harold walked, a police cruiser pulled up beside him, its flashing lights cutting through the calm night. Officer Brad, a man known for his stern attitude, stepped out of the car. His sharp gaze landed on Harold, immediately sizing him up. "Excuse me, sir," Brad said, his tone commanding. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Harold turned to face the officer, his calm eyes meeting Brad's suspicious glare. "Good evening, officer," Harold replied politely. "I'm just walking home after attending a charity event at the community center." Brad's expression hardened. "A charity event, huh? You've got ID to prove who you are." Harold nodded and reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license with steady hands. Brad examined it briefly but didn't seem satisfied. "What were you doing with that briefcase? Looks heavy for just walking around." Brad pressed, his tone edging on accusatory. "It contains paperwork from the event," Harold explained, keeping his voice even. "Would you like to see?" Brad shook his head, his suspicions already shaping his assumptions. "We've had reports of suspicious individuals in this area recently. I'm going to need you to come with me for further questioning," Brad said, ignoring Harold's explanation. Harold frowned slightly but kept his calm demeanor. "Officer, I assure you, I've done nothing wrong. I live just a few blocks away. You can verify my address." But Brad was not interested in listening. "I don't want to hear it," he snapped. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Harold hesitated, his composed face briefly showing a flicker of disbelief. Around them, a few neighbors peeked out of their windows and doors, watching the scene unfold. No one stepped forward, though. They simply whispered among themselves, uneasy but unsure of how to intervene. "I don't think this is necessary, officer," Harold said, trying once more to reason. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm more than willing to answer your questions." Brad's patience wore thin. "I said, turn around," he barked. Knowing the situation could escalate further if he resisted, Harold complied, turning slowly and placing his hands behind his back. Brad cuffed him tightly and led him to the police car. As he opened the back door, Harold paused and turned his head slightly toward the officer. "You might regret this later, officer," Harold said, his tone steady but with a hint of warning. Brad scoffed. "We'll see about that," he muttered, pushing Harold into the backseat. As the cruiser drove off, the neighbors exchanged glances, uneasy about what they had just witnessed. One elderly woman, Mrs. Carter, shook her head sadly. "That man didn't do anything wrong," she murmured to her husband. "I've seen him around here before. He's always so polite." Her husband nodded. "That officer will regret this," he replied quietly. Meanwhile, Harold sat silently in the back of the car, his mind calm despite the unjust treatment. He knew who he was, and he knew what this moment represented. Harold wasn't just an ordinary man. He was someone with the power to change things. He sighed softly, leaning back in the seat. The night was far from over, but Harold knew the truth would soon come to light. Harold sat quietly in the back of the police car, his hands cuffed behind his back. The leather of the seat felt cold, but his composure remained steady. He gazed out the window at the passing streetlights, his mind calm despite the unjust situation. He wasn't angry, but he couldn't deny the weight of disappointment pressing on his chest. This wasn't the first time he had encountered bias, but it stung just the same. Officer Brad glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You've got a lot of nerve walking around here like you own the place," Brad muttered, more to himself than to Harold. Harold didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the officer's reflection, noting the tension in his face. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured. "Officer, I don't believe I've done anything to deserve this treatment. I've complied with your requests and explained my presence. What more would you like to know?" Brad scoffed. "People like you always have a story," he said dismissively. "We'll sort it out at the station." Harold tilted his head slightly. "And if it turns out I'm telling the truth?" he asked calmly. Brad didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. As the car approached the station, Harold noticed the hustle and bustle of officers and civilians outside. The station was lit brightly, a stark contrast to the dim streets they had just driven through. When the car came to a stop, Brad stepped out and opened the back door. "Let's go," Brad said gruffly, helping Harold out of the car. Harold's hands were still cuffed, but he walked with his head held high, his posture dignified. The other officers outside noticed his calm demeanor, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. Inside, Brad led Harold to the front desk, where a younger officer sat typing on a computer. "Got another one," Brad said, handing over Harold's ID. "Says his name is Harold Johnson." The younger officer glanced up briefly, taking the ID. "What's the charge?" he asked. "Suspicious activity," Brad replied quickly. Harold raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. He knew better than to argue. As the booking process began, Harold couldn't help but observe the reactions of the officers around him. Some seemed disinterested, while others watched him with a mix of curiosity and unease. One officer, a woman named Officer Harris, frowned slightly as she looked at Harold's ID. "Harold Johnson," she murmured, her tone thoughtful. "This name sounds familiar." Brad shrugged. "Probably just another guy trying to make himself seem important," he said dismissively. But Officer Harris didn't look convinced. She studied Harold for a moment before asking, "Sir, may I ask where you work?" Harold met her gaze, his voice steady. "I work for the state," he replied. Brad let out a laugh. "Oh, sure. Let me guess, you're the mayor or something?" Harold's expression didn't change. "Not quite," he said simply. Officer Harris frowned again and typed something into her computer. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the information on the screen. She glanced at Harold, then at Brad, her expression turning serious. "Brad, we need to talk," she said firmly, gesturing for him to step aside. Brad looked confused but followed her to a corner of the room. "What's the problem?" he asked. Officer Harris held up the screen of her computer, her voice low but urgent. "That man you just arrested. He's not just anyone. He's Governor Harold Johnson." Brad's face turned pale, and he glanced back at Harold, who stood patiently, his calm demeanor unchanged. Back at the desk, Harold waited quietly, knowing the revelation would soon come. He didn't need to argue or raise his voice. The truth had a way of coming out, and he was confident it would speak louder than any accusation. For now, all he could do was watch as the pieces began to fall into place. Brad stood frozen, staring at the computer screen Officer Harris had shown him. The words "Governor Harold Johnson" seemed to jump off the page, mocking his earlier assumptions. "This can't be right," Brad muttered, his voice shaky. He looked over at Harold, who stood calmly by the desk, still cuffed but carrying himself with quiet dignity. "It's right," Officer Harris said firmly. "That man isn't just anyone. He's the state governor. You've made a huge mistake, Brad." Brad's face turned pale as he realized the gravity of his actions. He replayed every moment of the arrest in his head, the assumptions he'd made, the harsh tone he'd used, and the refusal to listen to Harold's explanations. Panic began to rise in his chest, but he tried to brush it off. "Maybe it's just someone with the same name," he said, though even he didn't believe his own words. Meanwhile, Harold remained silent, observing the commotion with an unreadable expression. He wasn't enjoying Brad's discomfort, but he couldn't ignore the small sense of satisfaction that the truth was finally coming to light. He had learned long ago that staying calm and composed often spoke louder than any heated argument. Officer Harris approached Harold and cleared her throat. "Governor Johnson, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding," she said, her voice filled with respect. "We're working to resolve this immediately." Harold nodded slightly. "Thank you, Officer Harris," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "I hope this situation serves as a lesson, not just for me, but for everyone involved." Brad hesitated before stepping forward. His usual confidence was replaced by uncertainty. "Governor, I didn't realize." He started, but Harold raised a hand to stop him. "You didn't realize who I was," Harold said calmly. "But that's not the point, is it? You treated me unfairly because of how I looked, not because of anything I did. Whether I'm the governor or not, everyone deserves respect and fairness." Brad opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. He felt the weight of Harold's words pressing down on him, forcing him to confront his own actions. The room was quiet, the other officers listening intently. Officer Harris quickly uncuffed Harold and handed him back his belongings. "Again, I deeply apologize for what happened tonight," she said. "If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let us know." Harold looked at her and then at Brad. "What's done is done," he said. "But moving forward, I hope this department takes steps to ensure situations like this don't happen again. Training, accountability, these are things that can make a real difference." Brad's face flushed with embarrassment. He had never felt so small. "I'm sorry, Governor," he said quietly, looking down. "I made a mistake." As Harold walked toward the exit, a small crowd of officers and civilians had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some looked at Harold with admiration, others with guilt. He paused at the door and turned back to address everyone. "Let this be a reminder," Harold said, his voice calm but firm, "that we all carry biases, whether we realize it or not. It's our responsibility to challenge those biases and treat everyone with the respect they deserve. That's how we create a better community." The room was silent as his words sank in. Harold then walked out of the station, his head held high, leaving Brad and the others to reflect on the lesson they had just learned. Back in the car, Harold let out a small sigh. His driver, who had come to pick him up, looked at him with concern. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked. "I'm fine," Harold replied with a faint smile. "Sometimes, the best way to teach a lesson is to let the truth speak for itself." As the car pulled away, Harold couldn't help but think of the long road ahead to change minds and hearts. But he knew that even small moments like this could spark the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, the events from the police station had already started spreading. One of the officers at the station, disturbed by what had happened, anonymously shared the story with a local journalist. By noon, the headlines were everywhere. "Governor wrongfully detained by local police officer." News stations picked up the story, and the incident began gaining attention across the state. Officer Brad, who had tried to keep the situation quiet, was now in the center of a media storm. His face and actions were being scrutinized by the public, who demanded answers. People from all walks of life, regardless of political affiliations, voiced their outrage over the injustice Harold had faced. Social media was filled with hashtags calling for accountability and reform. At home, Harold sat in his study, watching the news unfold on television. He sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't surprised that the story had gained traction, but he wasn't seeking revenge or public embarrassment for Brad. Instead, he hoped the attention would lead to meaningful conversations about systemic issues in law enforcement. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His wife, Margaret, stepped in. "Harold, are you seeing this?" she asked, gesturing toward the TV. He nodded. "I am. It's growing faster than I expected." Margaret sat beside him. "How do you feel about it?" Harold sighed. "I didn't want this to turn into a spectacle, but if it sparks change, then perhaps it's worth it. People need to see that bias and unfair treatment can happen to anyone, even someone in my position. Meanwhile, at the police station, Brad was pacing nervously in his office. The chief of police had called an emergency meeting to address the situation. Officers gathered in the conference room, the tension palpable. The chief, a stern but fair woman named Captain Monroe, addressed the group. "This is not the kind of attention our department wants or needs," she began, her tone sharp. "What happened last night was unacceptable. Governor Johnson may have handled the situation with grace, but that doesn't excuse the behavior that led to his arrest." Brad raised his hand hesitantly. "Captain, I didn't know he was the governor." "That's exactly the problem, Brad," Captain Monroe interrupted. "It shouldn't matter who he is. Every individual should be treated with respect, regardless of their title or appearance. This department is better than this, and it's clear we need to do more to ensure that incidents like this don't happen again." Officer Harris, who had been deeply affected by the incident, spoke up. "Captain, I think this is an opportunity for us to implement real changes. We need better training on recognizing and addressing biases. We also need to rebuild trust with the community. Right now, people are angry, and they have every right to be." Captain Monroe nodded. "I agree. I'm working on a plan to address these issues, but it's going to take everyone's cooperation. This isn't just about damage control. It's about doing the right thing." Brad sank into his chair, feeling the weight of his actions more heavily than ever. He knew he had made a mistake, but now he was beginning to understand the broader implications of that mistake. Back at the governor's mansion, Harold received a call from Captain Monroe. She apologized sincerely for what had happened and asked if he would be willing to meet with the department to discuss ways to improve their practices. Harold appreciated the gesture and agreed to meet. "This isn't just about me," Harold said on the call. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did. I'll do whatever I can to help." The news continued to spread, and the public rallied behind Harold. Community leaders reached out, expressing their support and sharing similar stories of bias and unfair treatment. Harold realized that this moment was bigger than himself. It was an opportunity to push for real change, and he was ready to lead the charge. As the day came to an end, Harold stood on his balcony, looking out at the city lights. Margaret joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked. Harold nodded. "It is. But change has to start somewhere." 2 days later, Harold arrived at the police station for the meeting. He was greeted by Captain Monroe, who extended her hand with a polite smile. "Governor Johnson, thank you for coming. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us," she said. Harold shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for inviting me, Captain. I'm here to ensure this situation turns into an opportunity for learning and change." As they walked into the conference room, Harold noticed a mix of faces among the officers. Some were curious, others looked uncomfortable, and a few seemed genuinely eager to hear what he had to say. Officer Harris, who had been instrumental in resolving the situation that night, gave him a respectful nod. Officer Brad, however, sat stiffly in his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment. Harold took his place at the front of the room, standing tall and composed. Captain Monroe introduced him briefly, and then Harold began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today not as your governor, but as a citizen who experienced something that no one should have to endure," he started. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. What happened the other night was a clear example of how bias can cloud judgment, leading to unfair treatment. The room was silent, all eyes on Harold as he continued. "I know that policing is a challenging job. You face difficult situations every day, and the decisions you make can impact lives. But it's precisely because of that responsibility that we must address the biases that can influence those decisions." Harold shared his perspective, explaining how the interaction with Officer Brad had unfolded. He didn't point fingers or assign blame, but focused on the larger picture. "This isn't just about me or Officer Brad. This is about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity and respect." He spoke about the importance of community trust and how incidents like his arrest could erode that trust. When people feel they cannot rely on the police to treat them fairly, it creates a divide that's hard to repair. We need to bridge that divide, not widen it. Harold's words seemed to resonate with many in the room. Officer Harris nodded in agreement, while others scribbled notes, clearly reflecting on his message. Brad, however, sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the table. After Harold finished, Captain Monroe took the floor. Governor Johnson has raised some important points, and I want to assure all of you that changes are coming. Starting next week, we'll be implementing mandatory bias training for all officers. This training isn't about blaming anyone. It's about making us better at our jobs and building stronger relationships with the community. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. I know some of you may feel defensive or uncomfortable, but change often starts with discomfort. Let's use this as an opportunity to grow. Harold was invited to stay for a Q&A session, during which officers asked thoughtful questions about how they could improve their interactions with the public. Harold appreciated their sincerity and offered practical advice, drawing from his own experiences and initiatives he had supported as governor. Toward the end of the session, Officer Brad finally spoke up. His voice was hesitant but genuine. "Governor, I want to apologize again for my actions. I didn't handle the situation correctly, and I let my assumptions get in the way. I'm truly sorry." Harold looked at him with a kind but firm expression. "Apology accepted, Officer Brad. I hope this experience has been a learning moment for you. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about striving to do better." As the meeting concluded, Harold felt a sense of hope. While there was still much work to be done, he could see the beginnings of change. Officers shook his hand and thanked him for coming, and Captain Monroe assured him that the department was committed to making improvements. When Harold stepped out of the station, the sun was shining brightly, as if signaling a fresh start. Margaret was waiting for him in the car, and as he climbed in, she asked, "How did it go?" Harold smiled. "It went well. It's not the end of the journey, but it's a step in the right direction." The days following Harold's meeting with the police department were filled with buzz and conversation. News outlets highlighted the governor's calm approach and the police department's pledge to implement changes. Social media platforms were flooded with debates about bias in law enforcement, with many praising Harold for handling the situation with grace and turning a personal injustice into a lesson for all. Harold, however, stayed grounded. His focus wasn't on the publicity but on the broader impact this incident could have. He knew that lasting change required more than just one meeting or one headline. It required continuous effort and accountability. At the governor's office, Harold sat with his team to discuss the next steps. "This is bigger than my experience," he told them. "We need to address systemic issues statewide, not just in one police department." His chief of staff, Laura, nodded. "I've already reached out to experts in community policing and bias training. We can start by implementing statewide training programs for all law enforcement officers." Harold leaned forward, his eyes serious. "It's not just about training. We need to involve the communities as well. People need to feel heard and respected. Let's organize town halls where citizens can share their experiences and concerns." Laura made notes as Harold continued. "And we need a system for accountability. If officers step out of line, there should be consequences. But we should also recognize and reward those who go above and beyond to serve their communities." Meanwhile, back at the police department, Captain Monroe was already taking steps to follow through on her promises. The mandatory bias training sessions were scheduled, and Officer Harris was tasked with helping to lead them. "You handled the situation with Governor Johnson well," Captain Monroe told her. "I think you can bring a valuable perspective to these sessions." Harris accepted the responsibility with humility. "Thank you, Captain. I hope we can make a real difference." Officer Brad, on the other hand, was struggling with the weight of his actions. His colleagues had mixed reactions. Some sympathized with the backlash he faced, while others believed he deserved the scrutiny. Brad himself knew he had to do better. He signed up for additional training sessions on his own time, and began reflecting on his interactions with the community. At the first town hall organized by Harold's team, the room was packed with citizens from all walks of life. Harold stood at the front, listening intently as people shared their stories. Some spoke about positive experiences with the police, while others shared moments of pain and injustice. One woman, a teacher named Angela, recounted how her son had been unfairly targeted by police officers while walking home from school. Her voice cracked with emotion as she said, "All I want is for my son to feel safe, to not be judged by the color of his skin." Harold approached the microphone. "Angela, thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage to speak about these experiences, and your words remind us why we're here. We cannot change the past, but we can work together to ensure a better future." The audience applauded, and Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was about rebuilding trust and fostering understanding. Back at the station, Officer Harris began her first bias training session with a group of officers, including Brad. "We all have biases," she said. "Recognizing them doesn't make us bad people, it makes us human. But we have a responsibility to not let those biases affect how we treat others." The officers listened, some nodding in agreement. Brad raised his hand. "I want to say something," he said. "I made a mistake with Governor Johnson, and I'm owning up to it. But I don't want that mistake to define me. I'm here to learn and do better." Harris smiled. "That's the first step, Brad, acknowledging where we went wrong and committing to change." As Harold watched these efforts unfold, he felt a sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but progress was being made. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he believed in the power of dialogue, accountability, and a shared commitment to justice. "This isn't just my story," Harold thought to himself. "It's a story for everyone who believes in the power of change." Weeks after the incident, Harold reflected on how one moment of injustice had sparked an opportunity for growth and change. The police department had started its bias training, and reports from the sessions were promising. Officers were engaging in honest conversations, sharing their experiences, and learning how to better serve the community. Officer Brad, in particular, had shown notable progress. He volunteered for additional community outreach programs and began participating in local events to build trust. One evening, he even visited a neighborhood youth center, sitting down with teenagers to answer their questions about policing. It wasn't easy, but Brad was determined to prove he could be better. Harold, meanwhile, was busy traveling across the state, hosting town halls, and meeting with community leaders. At each event, he listened more than he spoke, taking in the stories of those who had faced injustice and those who wanted to be part of the solution. At one gathering, an elderly man approached him after the event. "Governor Johnson," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "what you're doing means a lot. For people like me, who've seen too much unfairness in our time, it gives us hope." Harold placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank you for your words. Change takes time, but every step forward matters. Together, we can make a difference." At the same time, Harold's push for statewide police reform was gaining traction. His office proposed a comprehensive plan that included mandatory training, accountability measures, and programs to strengthen relationships between officers and the communities they served. One key feature of the plan was the creation of a civilian oversight board, a group made up of citizens from diverse backgrounds to review complaints against officers and ensure transparency. This idea sparked debates, but Harold stood firm. "Trust is built on accountability," he told reporters. "This isn't about punishing officers. It's about ensuring fairness for everyone." The story of Harold's wrongful arrest continued to resonate with people far beyond the state. National news outlets covered the reforms, and Harold was invited to speak at a conference on justice and equality. His message was clear. True leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about learning from them and working to create a better future. At the conference, he met other leaders who had faced similar challenges in their communities. They shared ideas and strategies, inspiring Harold to continue pushing for progress. This isn't just my fight, he realized. It's a fight for every community that's been overlooked, every voice that's gone unheard. One evening, Harold returned to the police station for a follow-up visit. This time, the atmosphere was markedly different. Officers greeted him warmly, and even Brad managed a respectful nod. Captain Monroe gave him a tour, showing him the changes they had implemented since his last visit. "We still have a long way to go," Monroe admitted, "but we're committed to doing the work." Harold smiled. That's all anyone can ask for. Progress doesn't happen overnight, but small steps lead to big changes. As he left the station, Harold felt a sense of fulfillment. The incident that could have left him bitter had instead become a catalyst for growth, not just for him, but for the community as a whole. At home, Harold sat with Margaret on their porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. "Do you think it was worth it?" Margaret asked softly. Harold nodded. "Absolutely. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. If this experience can make life better for even one person, then it's worth every step." Margaret smiled, her hand resting on his. "You've done something incredible, Harold. You've turned something painful into something powerful." As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the impact of Harold's story continued to ripple outward. Communities began to see small but meaningful improvements, and people felt inspired to speak up and work for fairness. Harold knew the journey was far from over, but he also knew that every journey began with a single step. And for him, that step had been the courage to turn an injustice into an opportunity for change.